containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece, and Africa as the birthplace.
Welcome to MythWisdom. Wisdom has built her 7 pillars. So today we're going to talk about a statement that Dr. Josh Bowen made recently on MythVision with Derek Lambert. He made some comment about Semitic slaves in Egypt, and so we're going to examine this whole idea of slavery in Egypt. Because there's been many books written about slavery in Egypt. Some people saying there wasn't any slavery, and some saying there was slavery. So I would think that it's a matter of interpretation to a certain degree, and for the most part, these people or these scholars are they have been uh, basically interpreting that there was slavery in Egypt for the most part, right? Uh, Never mind the fact that there is not an Egyptian word for slave. Okay, so I mean, which is kind of strange, but this is what we have. So there's no Egyptian word for slave, but they're telling us that there was slavery in Egypt. Okay, so we're going to see how they come to this conclusion in a few minutes. But first, we're going to take a look at the clip that Dr. Josh Bowen spoke about this slavery in Egypt. So let's take a look at it right
now. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen, author of many books. I've got some Patreon member questions, and this will be the first recording we do. Whether I launch it first or not, doesn't matter. Artie Hagen asks, for Dr. Joshua Bowen, much of the Bible seems tenuous from a contemporary historical perspective. Which is the earliest story, event, or person in the Bible that would you consider to reflect potentially reliable history? What would be the likely date of that narrative, and when was the narrative likely written?
Okay, we're gonna pause right here for a second, and that was a very good question. Okay, very good question, and as you can see, the question is about historical reliability of the biblical stories, right? And the funny thing about that is that this is a recurring theme in scholarship, or I guess you could call it European scholarship, for want of a better word. Okay, academia. So this is a recurring theme where they're saying that the Bible is history. So the question is about history, the historical reliability. Okay, so basically, what the assumption is by most of these scholars who are what they call who are members of what they call consensus scholarship. Okay, because you're gonna hear Dr. Josh Bowen appeal to the consensus when he's gonna make references to most scholars and this, that, and the other. So what happens with this Bible, these historicists, I call them the historicist priesthood. What they do is they assume that the Bible is history. When they go into studying the Bible, they automatically assume that it's history, and they work forward from there. Okay, as opposed to, like, for example, if they were studying Greek history, they wouldn't assume that Zeus, is history, or any of that is history. They would just assume that it's mythology, and they would operate from there. But when it comes to their own cultural environment, they can't seem to shake the cognitive dissonance, and so what they do is they assume that their basic, which is what is their faith. Actually, a lot of them, they're either Christian, Jew, or Muslim or something like that, right? One of the Abrahamic religions, most of these scholars. And so their scholarship is basically informed by their faith. It's like you can't separate it. They it's like a vicious circle, right? So they assume that this stuff is history, and then they operate as if it's history, and then they categorize it, uh, you know, using historical criteria. Okay, when they wouldn't do that with any other cultural mythology, whether it's Greek, ancient Egypt, or Indian mythology, or whatever. They call it what it is. They would call it mythology, but their mythology they call it history, right? So let's hear what Dr. Josh Bowen has to say.
Yeah, the question of sort of the historical veracity of stories in the Hebrew Bible, sort of like the perennial question, right? It always comes up. And the rule of thumb, I guess, that I think most scholars would say is that the further back in...
Okay, we're going to pause it right there. See, he just referred to, he said, before he even answered the question, he said he's answering it based on what most scholars would say. Okay, so this is what they call consensus scholarship. So this consensus scholarship is based on everybody in the group agreeing on one thing, okay, and then it's enforced by the group, and they enforce it in various ways. They enforce this consensus scholarship in various ways. So if you stray too far away from the consensus, it's going to affect you professionally in your life. It's going to affect you economically, okay, in terms of getting positions in various what they call tenure in various schools and so forth and so on. And it's also going to get you ostracized by the general community of scholars, okay. And this is what the consensus is. This is how the consensus is enforced, okay. And so this is what he's appealing to. So let's continue.
The further back in time that the narrative takes you, the less reliable it is. So, on one extreme, you go back to Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation accounts, least reliable maybe.
Okay, pause again. I hate to keep pausing, but this is very important. So he's saying that the Genesis, which is most scholars view as history, he's saying that's not so reliable because for whatever reason. But let's continue as history.
Like that whole primeval history era, least reliable, and then coming down into like the post-exilic period, that's much more reliable, right? So,
okay, just for point of reference, when he's talking about the post-exilic period, he's talking about after the so-called quote-unquote Babylonian exile, right? So he's talking about after that, which is around, I guess, 500 BCE, somewhere around there, approximately. But let's continue.
And there's sort of a time, I think, that most scholars would probably say that once you get into definitely by the 8th century, maybe by the 9th, what the Bible is describing, what the Hebrew Bible is describing is, obviously take out the supernatural stuff, but it's pretty close. And
okay, so here, okay, so he said once you get to around the 8th or the 9th century, somewhere around there, but just take out the supernatural stuff, and whatever the rest of the story is saying, it's close to history. It's close to being the truth. That's what he's saying here, right? Check out the supernatural stuff. Now, this is equivalent, okay, to the Christians when they say, "Oh yeah, Jesus really existed, but he didn't really walk on water. He didn't really rise from the dead. Just take out the supernatural stuff, and then you have the real history." So this is the same process we're seeing here with Dr. Josh Bowen. But let's continue.
And I would say even the Davidic stories, while I don't think that they represent an accurate historical depiction in the sense that it's something without spin, I think Joel Baden would argue pretty convincingly. He's got a book out on this talking about David, that the stories themselves represent a type of historical reality that, again, has been subjected to this sort of political spin. And so, you end up with a text that takes something that has David acting as essentially like a mob boss and spins it in such a way that the bad guy becomes the good guy and the good guy becomes the bad guy. And I think that for me, just the general rule of thumb, if you're talking about the patriarchs, talking about the primeval history, talking about the Exodus is probably the place that it starts to make a turn. And what I mean by that is, like, everybody relax, like all of you out there relax.
Okay. So at this point, it's kind of funny what he just said there, right? He said, okay, just relax. Everybody out there, just relax. So I'm kind of puzzled as to who he's actually talking to. If he's talking to the audience that's watching the video, or if he's trying to communicate to his peers, okay, in I mean, in academia, okay, because he's talking about, because a lot of the scholars would tell you that, you know would disagree what he just said in terms of, the Exodus and the, David, and they would say that all that stuff was absolutely real. Okay, it was absolutely history. So here, I'm not sure if he's trying to, assuage, any concerns by the academia, his academic peers out there, by saying, everybody out there relax. I'm not going to go too far off the path. Just wait. Just hear me out. So, but that's just speculation on my part. But I'm not sure what he's actually saying. But it just seems like that's what it is. But I could be wrong. So, but let's continue.
The Exodus, I think, probably represents, the story itself contains probably a kernel of truth, right? It's probably remembering some sort of historical reality or based on some sort of historical reality. So, I mean, like, we know that Semitic peoples were slaves in Egypt. We know that Semitic people escaped from Egypt.
Okay, so this is my area of concern. This is what this video is about. He just said that we know that Semitic peoples were slaves in Egypt, and we know that Semitic peoples escaped from Egypt. Okay, this is the issue for me right here. Now, again, as I referenced earlier, as far as we know, and for what I've seen, there is no Egyptian word for slavery. But here we have Dr. Josh Bowen, and not just Dr. Josh Bowen, a lot of other scholars, because they have been, writing books about slavery in Egypt, for years. Okay, but here we have Dr. Josh Bowen, making that statement, and so I thought I'd do a little bit of research on the topic, because again, as far as I know, there was no slaves in ancient Egypt, and basically this is just, anti-Egyptian, propaganda at this point, because most of the ideas of slavery existing in Egypt have to do with the so-called Semitics, or the Jews in ancient Egypt, right? So this that kind of reference that Dr. Josh Bowen is talking about is a biblical reference that he's putting in here. He's basically, I mean, and most of the scholars, I would think that there was slavery in Egypt. The way they got that from is from the Bible, right? Basically, that's the source of this polemic against the ancient Egyptians. Okay, I mean, there's many things about ancient Egypt that we get from uh, the Hebrew Bible, in the terms of negative comments. According to them, the Egyptians were idolaters and this, that, and the other. There was pagans. So all of this nonsense, right? And this is what we get, from the biblical perspective when it comes to Egypt. But the problem is, was that really the case? Because as we know, and just to get a different point of view, we're going to listen to something that Dr. Kipp says, which is pretty interesting. And so here's what Dr. Kipp has to say about something similar, and not about slavery in Egypt, but about the historical, quote unquote, historical record. Okay, when it comes to the biblical narrative.
It's, again, this is still stuff that we're just kind of piecing together. So all that said, when it comes to tracing these traditions back, here's what we discover is that we kind of come to a starting point, and it's the same for all of them. At some point, probably in the early third, maybe the late fourth, early third century BCE. That's sort of as far back as we can track this stuff, realistically. This is where it all began. And as I mentioned to an apologist that people might be familiar with on Twitter, Dr. Stephen Boyce, I was in a conversation with him on the phone once, not that long ago, talking about this issue. And as I said it to him, anything back prior to, like the early third, late fourth century with regards to the text, with regards to the religion, it's a black box. We just can't get in there. There's very little actual material culture that survives from the period that provides us any meaningful insight into what was going on in Judaism at the period. So
Jonathan Adler.
This is exactly what Jonathan Adler talks about.
Yes, his book on the origins of Judaism as a religion, and obviously.
Okay. So now you see, there's two different perspectives, right? So according to Dr. Kip Davis, once you get past 300 BCE, everything is a black box. There is no material evidence for any of the other stuff, such as the Exodus, the Davidic dynasty, the Solomon's temple, or any of that. Okay, so basically, we have two opposing perspectives here, and the time frame. For example, the Exodus supposedly, approximately, let's just say around 1200 BCE. Okay, this was supposed to have happened, and then we are hearing Dr. Kip talk about 300 BCE, right? So 300 BCE, 1200 BCE, right? That's 900-year difference, right? so this is for this so-called history that they're talking about, right? So in terms of Dr. Kip, he's saying the history doesn't go back past 300 BC. Really, after that, it's a black box. We don't know what. None of that. Nothing is reliable after that. Dr. Josh Bowen is saying we can go all the way back to 1200 BCE, and there's some historical kernel of truth there, and without so quote unquote spin. Okay, without if you take away the spin and the supernatural. All right. So remember, we're talking about history, but he's talking about supernatural. So again, you can see the cognitive dissonance here. If we're talking about supernatural, how is that history? Is history supernatural? And there's but in order to make it history, you have to take out the supernatural, right? So yeah, this is really strange. This is what I call strange scholarship, right? So anyway, we're going to talk about this slavery thing because that's my main contention here in this video. That's what the video is all about. But we're going to listen to a little bit more about what Dr. Josh Bowen has to say.
And we know that Egypt was, of course, in control of Canaan for much of the second half of the second millennium. So I think those historical truths, those historical realities, more than likely informed this memory that the Exodus seeks to, or that the Exodus was built upon or built up around.
Okay, now we're coming into something more, he's saying that the Exodus was built up around some historical kernel, and he quotes he referenced the Egyptian administrative history over what they call Canaan, okay, which was not really a name. That's just a biblical name. That people in what we now call Canaan wouldn't know what the hell you're talking about if you call them Canaanites. But so basically, he's conflating the history and the mythology, the Exodus, and then he's referencing actual Egyptian history. When he said that they administered, uh, Palestine for much of the second millennium, right? So that's correct what he's saying. But then again, when you look at the actual history, as which we can do by studying Egyptian documents and Egyptian historical documents because they recorded much of the history of that area, and then you examine the biblical narrative of the same area, then you find that it's nothing, none of that Exodus, the Davidic kingdom, the wall of Jericho, the Noah, none of that stuff is happened according to the historical record. Okay, it's all mythology at the end of the day. But uh, in the Hebrew Bible, all of that is treated as history, and so here we have scholars, okay, who is actually going along and treating it as history as well, and then going and making all these comments about Semitic slaves in Egypt and this and that. So this is what we want to discuss. So now let's take a look at something simple, about Egypt, slavery in Egypt. We're gonna go like to Wikipedia and take a look at it. All right, this thing about slavery, and so we're gonna read this passage in Wikipedia about slavery, which more or less gives you a general consensus of what the scholarship is today about slavery in ancient Egypt. Right. This is basically when you read this article here, it basically describes what most people think about slavery in Egypt. Okay, whether we talk about academia or just people in general, right? So let's take a look at it. Slavery in ancient Egypt. Okay, so let's see what it says. Slavery in ancient Egypt existed at least since the Old Kingdom period. So here he just made a definitive statement that the slavery, this is a definitive statement, okay? Slavery in ancient Egypt existed at least since the Old Kingdom period. So he's clear on that, right? Let's go to the next sentence. Discussions of slavery in pharaonic Egypt are complicated by terminology used by the Egyptians to refer to different classes of servitude over the course of dynastic history. Interpretation of the textual evidence of classes of slaves in ancient Egypt has been difficult to differentiate by word usage alone. Right? So, first, he made a definitive statement that there's slavery existed in Egypt, right? Which is typical of the scholarship of today, as we saw with Dr. Josh Bowen. And then he goes on to say that it is difficult to differentiate by word usage alone. So what that is saying under the table, or is basically that they don't have a word for slavery. Okay, they're just interpreting that there was slavery in Egypt, but there's no word for it. But let's continue. There were three types of enslavement. Again, here we go with the enslavement, right? Even though he just said it's difficult to differentiate by word usage alone, right? All right. Uh, and the reference for that is the Slavery Pharaonic Egypt Encyclopedia of Ancient History. See right, the reference right there. Okay, so there were three types of enslavement in ancient Egypt: chattel slavery, right, bonded labor, and forced labor. But again, here he says again, but even these seemingly well differentiated types of slavery are susceptible to individual interpretation. Egypt's labor culture encompassed many people of various social ranks. The word translated as slave from the Egyptian language does not neatly align with the modern terms or traditional labor roles. Okay? So here he's telling you the word translated as slave. Not that the word means slave, but it's translated as slave in into English, right? So the word translated as slave from the ancient Egyptian from the Egyptian language does not neatly align with modern terms or traditional labor roles. The classification of servant, peasant, and slave could describe different roles in different contexts. So so wait a minute. So you're saying so here you're saying that a slave might not be a slave and peasant might not be a peasant and servant might not be a servant. It depends on the context, okay, of what they're doing, which is strange because as far as I know, if you're a slave, you're a slave. I mean, But let's continue. Egyptian texts refer to the word bak and him that mean laborer or servant. Okay, it means laborer, a worker. Okay, it's a worker or servant, right? Some Egyptian language refers to slave-like people, again with the slave-like people, as skoranks, meaning bound for life. Forms of forced labor and servitude are seen throughout all of ancient Egypt. So now you say that forms of forced labor, right, and servitude are seen throughout not slavery, servitude and forced labor is seen throughout all of ancient Egypt. Egyptians wanted dominion over their kingdoms and would alter political and social ideas to benefit their economic state. The existence of slavery not only was profitable for ancient Egypt, but made it easier to keep power and stability of the kingdoms. Okay, now let's continue. During the Old Kingdom period, prisoners of war captured by Kemet's army were called skoranks. So here again, we have to really dig into what they're saying. Above here, he had said that you know he had said the word skorank means bound for life, right? Uh, Meaning bound for life, and the way he said it, he says he called it a slave-like people known as skoranks. Down here, he's saying that these people that he's calling slaves are actually prisoners of war, right? So here, let's continue. So during the Old Kingdom, and just to give you a reference, we can look at some prisoners of war in ancient Egypt, right? So here they go, ancient Egyptian prisoners of war. Okay, Seti, people from the land of Set, which is Nubia, somewhere around there. Then you have the Libyans, okay, and then you have the Tejano, which is like the Canaanites. Okay, so let's go back to the slavery narrative. So during the Old Kingdom period, prisoners of war captured by Chemist's army was called skorina, bound for life. A distinct this was not a distinct term for slave, but for prisoners of war. Okay, but up above here, he actually said there were a slave-like people called skorina, meaning bound for life. Okay, so again, it's contradiction. So basically, what we are seeing here that there is no word for slave in ancient Egypt, but they're trying to use these various terms like prisoners of war, like captured soldiers, POWs, and calling them because they've been captured, they call them slaves. So what I would have to ask is that when we capture prisoners of war here in the West or in currently are they slaves because they're prisoners of war? Like even right now, we have people in Guantanamo Bay that's been there. The war, supposedly the war on terror has been over for years, but still, they're still in Guantanamo Bay. So are they slaves there? But let's continue. So it says here again, this was not a distinct term for slave, but for prisoners of war, as I already stated. The term HM or hem emerged at least two distinct usages: laborer and two, servant. So both of the words that he's trying to tell you, both of these two words, him and skorak or squanak or squarank, however you pronounce it, both of these two words, one means labor and another means servant. So none of these words mean slave. But at the top of this article, he says slavery existed in Egypt since the Old Kingdom. I mean, at the end of at the end of the day, I could just end the argument here. Okay, I mean, we could end it right here and just leave it at that because we already see the contradiction that's going on, and this is typical of the this scholarship that we're seeing.